Hey, ladies and gents, welcome to the Controlled Interest Gamecast, episode 250. We made it. As always, I'm your host, Jerrad Wyche, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dominic Orlando.
Ready to get that Elden bling today, Jerrad.
Yeah, we're finally doing our Elden Ring Spoilercast. We've both been finished it for a while, but we felt, hey, the 250th episode of our podcast feels like the right time to do a Spoilercast. I think the only other Spoilercast we've done was Last of Us Part 2. Which was a while ago, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
I kind of want to make these a more often occurrence. It's just we don't always play the same games and beat them at the same time.
Right.
But then again, we might end up making it a thing where it doesn't necessarily have to be a new game either. There might be something that we both decide, like, hey, let's both check that out. It was a backlog game and we both played, and we can do a spoiler cast then too, because I like talking about a game and deep diving, so.
Kind of on that same note, I am now fully and officially back into Xbox territory with the Series S. It's been really cool, but also, of course, I have Game Pass, so I think it will be a little more natural for us to align on, playing games at the same time, whether they just came out on Game Pass or, they're still on there. I know I still have a handful that you've told me about that I need to catch up on. Backbone was one. Spiritfarer is on Game Pass. I want to check that out.
Is Unpacked or Unpacking on Game Pass? Yeah,
yep.
There's a lot of really good games on that service.
So there's a lot of Game Pass stuff I want to catch up on that I've been missing the past year or so that's come out.
So the way this Spoilercast is going to work is we kind of made this document with, I think it was 9 total questions or categories for the game, and we're going to go through them step by step. We each kind of filled it out on our own to give our own perspective on Elden Ring. So I guess we'll start up with the easiest question. Well, it might not be the easiest question, but it is the first question is, did it live up to the hype? Obviously, going into this game, like a lot of FromSoftware games, people were highly anticipating it. There was a lot of buzz around it. The clickbait for when the release date was going to be revealed was huge. Obviously, it had the pop at the Game Awards with the little pot friend walking out on stage with Jeff Keighley. A lot was going on. This was on the heels of Cyberpunk, right? That had a lot of hype, and it came out and it was a dud in many ways. Obviously, it's in a better place now. I guess we'll start with you, Dom. In your opinion, it should be an easy question to answer, right? But maybe personally and also generally speaking, did this live up to the immense hype that was leading up to its release?
Yes. A short answer, yes. No surprise there, right? But I want to think about it in terms of expectations are super high, but this was we always point out FromSoftware puts out games at a pretty good pace, pretty good cadence, not quite Call of Duty quick, but every 2 or 3 years they're putting out a game and they're generally very good. They're also generally, this I think was the FromSoftware game that took the biggest departure from everything before it. I think I might be wrong. Or other people might have different opinions, but I think it was the riskiest for them. It did the most different. It was obviously the biggest game they've done, and it was shooting really high. It had its sets high. It had its sights set really high, and I think it more than lived up to that. It drew a lot from Breath of the Wild and injected the best parts of that game into that Souls formula that we already like. So, yeah, it's hard to imagine. It feels like more often than not we get really excited for something, and it's either okay, yep, this is good. This is what I thought. More of this. It's great. It's cool. It's good. Or it's a letdown, like you mentioned, Cyberpunk. Or it was something we never heard of and it blew us out of the water, right?
Or if it was something we didn't know what to expect, like God of War Ragnarok, which was an established franchise, but it also caught people, off guard based on the jump that made for the franchise. So.
And that's a weird one too, because I feel like I see a lot of people claiming that there was a lot of hype for that game before it came out, and I don't remember that at all. I feel like people were kind of hesitant, oh, what are they going to do with God of War now? And then after it, once it did come out, it was oh shit.
Well, the previews were the Leviathan axe is really cool from all the stuff that people got to play early, but I don't think the hype was anywhere before that game released anywhere near Cyberpunk or Elden Ring. I think people were very cautiously optimistic, but I don't think there was a lot of hype there.
Mm-hmm. And then so with Elden Ring, it was kind of a more unique case of expectations were super high for this. And it somehow did even better than those expectations. And yeah, we're going to get into some more of the specifics, obviously, with the next couple questions. But yeah, I think it lived up and surpassed that hype. And that makes things a little scary, I think, looking forward for God of War Ragnarok, for Starfield, and some of these enormous games that are on the horizon that also have really big, hype and lead up. And now, after Elden Ring, the standards have been set pretty high, I think. So, but staying on Elden Ring, absolutely, it surpassed the hype, and now we're here, Elden blinging.
So, stick with me on this. I would like to compare Elden Ring to like a Peyton Manning or LeBron James. And what I mean by that is, so Michael Jordan and Tom Brady, LeBron James and Peyton Manning are all considered the greatest of all time at their position. And the argument goes one way or another. Those are like, for basketball, it's between LeBron and Michael Jordan. And then for a quarterback, it's between Tom Brady and Peyton Manning, right? And the difference between them, the reason I pair them like that is Michael Jordan and Tom Brady are the type of person whose career trajectory was they were the underdog, and then they surpassed expectations no one ever thought they could even come close to. Whereas in the other side, Peyton Manning and LeBron James were phenoms. They were regarded as going to be the best of the best since they were
Since
little.
middle school.
And they not only lived up to those expectations, but surpassed it. And I think a lot of times when people look at those athletes and they determine who, in their opinion, is the greatest, I think it's what people end up finding more amazing in terms of overcoming or achieving. So like with LeBron and Peyton, it's like it's one thing to have those expectations. How many players and athletes have those crazy expectations, and how many of them might match it or come underneath that? Whereas they were sky high and they even surpassed those, which is really impressive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the opposite end, it's like, well, Michael Jordan and Tom Brady, they were good, but they were never considered. You hear the story about Michael Jordan getting cut from his high school team. You hear Tom Brady getting taken in the 6th round. It's like they weren't expected to be the players they ended up becoming. That's pretty impressive too. No one's looking at you and you end up becoming one of the greatest of all time. Elden Ring, obviously, I think is LeBron James, Peyton Manning of like, people expected this game to be good. FromSoftware has built a reputation, and not only did they do that, they surpassed those expectations. Whereas a game, like you said, that comes out of nowhere is more of that Michael Jordan, Tom Brady, and they're both very impressive in their own ways. I just think sometimes a lot of that expectation can build stress and build pressure, and not everybody can handle that pressure. So when they actually succeed in that venue, it's really impressive. I don't have anything else to add in terms of, they matched the hype and beat it. And it is impressive because we have seen games come out and, we can go back to Fallout 4, right? Which wasn't a bad game. It wasn't on the Cyberpunk level in terms of release, but it also didn't match the hype of what people wanted from that next Fallout game. And we hope we get that with Starfield. So, it lived up to the hype, and it's pretty impressive for this type of studio. We talk about often, like, I think the closest studio in the West that can match both the output and the quality is Insomniac Games, in terms of how quickly they release games. And when Elden Ring released earlier this year, they already announced that their next game is in the final stages of production. It's assumed to be Armored Core, but it could be Sekiro 2, hopefully maybe a Bloodborne 2 or something. But yeah, their cadence, especially with the scope of this game and the scale of it, is incredible.
And I'd add to the scope and scale, both of is the game itself, but also this game, came out on like 8 different platforms, like Xbox One, Xbox One X, Series S, Series X, PlayStation's 4 Pro and 5, and etc. PC, obviously.
The fact that it's playable on the Steam Deck.
The Steam Deck, even, they made it playable there. Like, this is that like cross-generational point of time where like the expectation is kind of like you're putting your game out on as many platforms or tons of different platforms, which that's a lot of extra bug fixes and optimization and all that. And it's hard to I don't even hardly blame developers when that doesn't go well, when like, the PlayStation version isn't all that great, or it's not fully taking advantage of the PS5 or 4, whatever, all that kind of stuff, like, feels nitpicky. But for the most part, like, there's a few bugs and minor things, but the game wasn't anywhere close to what any reasonable person would call broken or unstable or anything like that.
At worst, it's like that typical FromSoftware jank, right, that we sometimes get that they usually iron out. It's funny because, nothing against like Naughty Dog games, they're incredible, but an alternate dimension where Naughty Dog is a multi-platform developer, like, can they still reach those quality benchmarks if they're developing for more than a couple of platforms at a time, and it is impressive. And
And
I
the
do think we have
time
to.
it takes, like to your point, Naughty Dog, really good games, but they spend a lot of time for a game much smaller in scope. Maybe not like, I mean, it's just smaller like than Elden Ring,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I don't know how else to say it. Like it's equally, maybe technically impressive, but it's just smaller. And we've heard those reports about the way they make games is kind of not sustainable, where like not super efficient, um, but it's polished by the end of it when it does come out. So yeah, I think we can't talk enough about like From Software is like they're just getting shit done somehow. They're cranking these things out.
Speaking of, plotting them, let's get to some of the game's strengths. I listed mine out loosely, and we can go over them. We can go back and forth. How many do you have? I have 5 listed.
I have one that I listed because I think I wanted to focus most on it, um,
Okay.
because
So
it's like the biggest thing that's different from the previous From games. But yeah, we'll touch on a lot.
I'll go over 3 of mine, then we'll go over yours, and then we'll go over my last 2. Okay.
Okay.
I think that sounds good. So first up is exploration. I mean, and I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but in From games there is a sense of exploration, but this one, because it's open world and to our point of the scale of it being so huge, you really feel as if you going and, oh wow, there's this weird little forest. What's in here? Why are there these glowing turtles? Why is there like this tower? I can't get in. Oh wait, there's this like weird riddle on the front that I have to solve. Or you find a random enemy that's just chilling, and in typical From fashion, you go and mess with that enemy and it leads you to a different area, and everything kind of builds on itself in a really unique way. Because it's open world, we've talked about this before, the NPCs and where you can find them feels less structured in a good way than previous From titles, because it always felt as if, oh, you're going to reach this checkpoint, there's going to be an NPC here that you're going to interact with. And in this game, because it's open world, it doesn't feel as checkpointy in that you come across a random woman sitting on a log bench, right? And she's like, oh, my father's castle is under attack. He didn't want me to be there. And it seems like it's more organic storytelling in that way. Next up, sense of mystery. This kind of goes along with the exploration of the environmental storytelling, both in the open world and then when you get in these tighter corridors of these buildings. It just, you don't know what lurks behind any corner, because it's not that From games have a pattern, but if you play enough of them, you kind of understand how things are going to be designed. That doesn't take away from them being well designed. It just means you kind of know what to expect. And once again, with this being open world, they tend to play with those expectations in a really clever way. And because the game isn't only scaled wide in terms of on a horizontal scale, it's also on a vertical scale. They do a really good job of having you explore different levels to buildings too, like the first floor, second floor, third floor, and it all comes together really cool. And then lastly, this one is the one I probably had to spend the least amount of time on, because it's like the thing that From's known for, the combat. Obviously the addition of like the spirits add a unique twist to the From formula, and I like that you can respec your character at any time, meaning you're not locked into a certain combat style, which is also really good. Yeah, overall, if you play From games, you know that their combat is going to be one of the shining points of the game, and obviously Elden Ring delivered. I want to hear what this one focused thing is. I'm curious.
So it's one that you already mentioned, and that's the exploration. Because I think this is, you mentioned combat, and to me, combat is really great in this game. Um, you know, maybe a tick better than like Dark Souls 3 and previous From games, where it's kind of like the next step in some of that. Like they always find a way to like make more bosses, and with each new game to like tweak the way the combat works just a little bit to make it kind of hard to reintroduce yourself. Even like I made the joke, like most of the bosses in Elden Ring are similar to a Dark Souls boss, but there's just an extra second or two or three delay in the attack timing from all the bosses, which throws off my expectations. I'm so used to the what it used to be. So little things like that, I think, kind of make the combat like still really good and fresh enough and new enough. But the one thing that stood out to me the most, that impressed me the most, is the exploration, because this is just so open. And I'm gonna reference Breath of the Wild a lot today, I guess. So there are points in that game where you're just there's something really natural about the way you want to go and look under every little rock and go in every little corner and figure everything out. Um, and the same thing is present here in Elden Ring, but I think even more so. And also at around the 50-hour mark in Breath of the Wild, I kind of lost that desire to want to explore everything, and I wanted to just beat the game already. I wanted to do dungeons and things like that. Um, but in Elden Ring, it just, to me, that was just that same feeling from Breath of the Wild was just extended and done even better, and it lasted 100 hours or more. So I stopped at that point after I beat the game, right? But yeah, to me, that's the biggest thing, is the way the world naturally incentivizes you to explore and find things. It's not check boxes, not icons on the map, things like that. There's not like explicit rewards necessarily for exploring. You're kind of just doing it because you want to, and then you will get rewarded too. And you may or may not use that thing right away or whatever it is, but that sense of exploration was something very, at least the way it was done in Elden Ring, very new in a FromSoftware game. And that to me was like the biggest strength that this game brought. And I'm again comparing it to like previous From games as well. So it, especially compared to those, the exploration is just as top tier as it could possibly get.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think a lot of game developers who make open world games follow the same rules of like, okay, there needs to be a point of interest ever so in terms of the distance from the player, so that way they're always engaged. And even though a developer follows those rules, there's like a uniqueness to how you actually design the world to make it engaging, right? Like just because you create a point of interest doesn't mean it's going to be interesting to the player. And with From Software, they absolutely nailed that. Um, it's funny that was my first one I listened when I was like game strengths exploration #1, and you're like, that's the one. That's the one.
Mm-hmm.
My last two, this goes also with the open world design, is the sense of scale. In most From games, you certainly get a sense of scale, especially with the bosses you engage with. With this game, it was really interesting that as the game progressed, that scale got larger and larger, and you felt less and less capable isn't the right word, but like you understood your place in this world. And what I mean by that is when you first start the game, I think the first sense of skill that kind of catches you off guard is when the dragon appears in the lake near the opening area of the game. You're like, okay, I've seen big From bosses before, but yeah, I gotta understand that I can come across bosses like this. And then when you first get to the underground city and you come across one of those rooms where one of the large people are sitting in the throne or whatever it is, I actually took a picture of that for the first time because that's incredible. It looks so cool. And for me, the scale of enemies is one of the most interesting things you can do in designing a world because, so often we play games that are meant to be power fantasies. And I think at its core, From games are meant to make you understand that it isn't a power fantasy, that you are but a lonely being in this dark world, and it's up to you to try to overcome all of that, which I think is really cool. So yeah, the sense of scales.
And there's been many tarnished, and none of them have become Elden Lord. You won't be.
Yeah, but the sense of scale generally in this game is great. And then lastly, is a shoe, and I think that we often don't praise enough because I don't think it's necessarily at the top of the top when looking at the video game industry, but the music and score in this game is incredible.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the boss themes are outstanding. But because a lot of the other parts of the game are so strong, I think that often gets lost in the mix. And it's one of those things where, like, if the music and the score are really good, you don't notice it as a flaw, so you don't really appreciate it as much, Whereas, like, if a game has a really bad score, it's like, oh, I got to put this, lower the music volume in this game. So, yeah, I wanted to shout out that as well. And with that, we got to get to, no game is perfect. We got to nitpick. I actually have 3 weaknesses I wanted to list. And once again, in the grand scale of the quality of this game, these are absolute nitpicks. Like, I don't think these are, like, ruining, game experience ruining or anything like that. How many do you have listed?
Just one.
Just one. Okay, I'll do my first 2. Though I didn't have an issue with it, looking back on the game, I do think there was too many palette swap bosses. Obviously, the game features hundreds of bosses, and a lot of them are the same boss with a slight twist. And that's fine in the moment, but I do think that towards the end of my adventure, I found myself avoiding a lot of the smaller optional bosses just because it's like I don't need the souls. I don't need the experience because I've already fought that boss before. It kind of turned me off in a way where I was just like, I don't really need to do that, which I think was a bit of a bummer. I think there was a little bit more variety. Once again, it is a nitpick. It wasn't like super noticeably bad or anything like that. It just is something that could be improved if we ever do get a sequel.
Yeah, mine is similar, and maybe it'll also come up on your list too. But a lot of the dungeons that you go into, there's like 3 or 4 different styles, right? There's the caves, or the tunnels rather, the dungeons, and one more I'm not thinking of. But the dungeons and the caves and the tunnels, they they'd feel like they'd be a different layout, different enemies in each one, but they'd always have like kind of the same, a lot of reused assets, I guess you could tell. Like basically they just made different hallways go different directions, but it was just very similar, a lot of them. They each had their own unique puzzles, but there was just too much of that, and that was kind of one thing where I'm like, oh yeah, it's another one of these dungeons. Now that being said, you do find some later on in the game where you think that, but then something happens in the dungeon that's like way different than what's been going on before, so they kind of subvert you a little bit. But even still, like through much of the game, and that's like, it's 40 hours in by the time I'm finding a dungeon, and like all of a sudden, instead of just the regular dungeon with these guillotines coming down and the same puzzles, it's all of a sudden it's like a battle being waged among like all these like enemies, NPCs basically, all fighting each other, and you like walk in like, oh shit, like, and you can start to fight too, but it's gonna be tough. And that one really caught me off guard. I was like, holy crap, what the heck is going on in here? This is just nuts. But yeah, even still, I still kind of pointed that out as a thing, that some of those dungeons were repetitive.
Well, and I think that's the interesting thing is because I think they still feel handcrafted to a certain extent. They weren't like procedurally generated. And I wonder if that's one of the trade-offs, right, of like avoiding crunch or avoiding these type of things is like, well, yeah, we just got to reuse assets because that's the best efficient way to do things. I might get a little bit of pushback for this one because I know this is what From's known for, and I want to be specific about my complaint. And that's some of the unnecessary obtuseness in the game. Obviously, that's a trademark of From. There's going to be stuff in there that's, made to be obtuse on purpose. But some of the core gameplay elements of the game, I kind of push back on it being unnecessarily obtuse. One of them is upgrading spirits. Most of the people I know who played didn't know you had to have the conversation between the girl and the blacksmith and go back and forth in order for her to unlock the ability to upgrade your spirits. And that's something like the spirits are so core to the experience. And as we've mentioned, they help dictate the difficulty in the game. They're a way for you to alleviate difficulty if you so choose, or at least change the gameplay too. And I think that being such a weird, obtuse way to unlock that, I actually had to tell my friends about it so they could upgrade their spirits. I think like there's a point and place to be obtuse for player discovery. For something like that that's a core gameplay mechanic, I think, make it straightforward and easy to understand for most people. So
yeah, there's definitely things like that, or when some people don't even find the bell used to call the spirits because they never went back to that first church area. Right?
Exactly. And so that's different than like buying a torch and using it in dark areas, because I think that's a player discovery thing. I don't think you need to be told, hey, buy a torch, you can use it in dark areas. I think it's cool to be like, why is this person selling a torch for like no money, grabbing it, equipping it, and then realizing, oh, it actually lights up dark spaces. I think that's a cool place to be obtuse on purpose. But like you said, with the core gameplay stuff, it's like, oh, somebody's going to miss out on a core part of the game simply because they didn't go back at night to this church to get the bell. It's, come on now.
And then there's that like snobby thing where, someone might say like, well, actually that's their intention, and clearly you're not getting, like, just because it might be an intentional design in the game doesn't mean that someone has to like it, right? It's not just because it's not a bug, it's a feature. It's just not every feature is for everyone all the time.
Yeah, and you can counter argue like, what does that add to the experience, right? Like, the the worst case is going to be something they don't experience. So what does it add to any player? And it's not like we're getting anything extra because that conversation, the grand scheme of that character, the NPC story, isn't like that important. Much of the other information you get later on is. So it's like, what does that add in terms of it being secretive? And then the last one, I don't want to touch on it too much because I think we're going to talk about it later in the podcast. The final boss fight. I've talked about it. Like it's like 50%. The first 50% is absolutely incredible, and the last 50% is, in my opinion, the worst final boss fight in a FromSoftware game for me. But like I said, we'll talk about that later more specifically. But yeah, those are my weaknesses. Once again, nitpicking, but yeah, no game's perfect. You?
Yeah, so I mean, I mentioned the dungeons, but otherwise, I go back and forth on this. There's a lot of different endings that can be had in this game, and there's a lot of different NPC quests, that feed into which ending you're gonna get, and it takes you would never discover them naturally, I guess. Certainly not all of them. You would have to play for thousands of hours, which I guess some people have to put these wikis together. So like they're doing the work, but it almost feels like it's cool because it just creates more replay value. But I don't know if that alone to me doesn't get like that's not going to give me the replay value. Like I'm not going to play through the game for the 9th and 10th times to see the slightest variation of the endings, right? So I don't know. Sometimes, and that's obviously where the obtuseness comes in too, because if you have to, talk to specific NPCs and do specific things, in a specific order before doing other things that might, progress the story in certain ways, and a lot of these things you would never know. I don't know. Sometimes it can get to be a little bit extra. But that's also kind of the fun of it too, where like, months after you're done even playing the game and you go back, or even sometimes months later, like someone else, like the entire world doesn't even we probably haven't discovered everything there is to discover in this game, right? Collectively, all of us.
Oh, for
right?
sure.
There's going to be things that come up, and like if things are done in a certain sequence, that this happens, all that kind of stuff, right? That's kind of I'm talking myself into this actually being a positive now because it's bringing me back to the days of like Pokemon on the Game Boy and when N64 games when like we didn't know, we were kids just trying to figure it all out, and we didn't even have guides to know how to find everything, and it could be months afterward, the games come out and like we find out about some secret that we discovered that like nowadays a lot of that is lost in wikis and guides, right? Because it's so easy to figure everything out. Whereas FromSoftware is kind of like pushing back, creating like an absurd amount of obtuseness to kind of maybe recreate a little bit of that magic. But it's both a positive and a negative, I guess.
Yeah, I think for me, because the narrative isn't at the forefront of From games, it doesn't bother me that much because I just see it as like my experience, and then I just watch stuff on YouTube after I finish the game of like, let me check out this ending, I want to see what happens with this NPC. And I think part of that is because the game is so long that I don't want to go back and replay
Right.
for all these different alternate endings. So it's kind of like a choose your own adventure book, and then I just watch the greatest hits after I'm done with it, kind of. But it's funny how you're like, I don't know. Actually, I'm talking myself into this.
Yeah.
This next section is the favorites. So we're gonna go over specific parts of the game that are our favorites. For each of them, I listed one for each one. I'm assuming you did the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So first up for me, the a design element. This is more of a vague category. I put the teleport gates. These are the circular little ball things you come across randomly that teleport you to random areas. Oftentimes it's to an area that's usually unapproachable beforehand, and then you kind of can work your way back to the original place in which you teleported from. Sometimes it's completely random, like the one leading up in right before you fight at the library. There's the one that teleports you to the church with the pastor turtle, which we'll get into later.
Yeah, Pope.
Yeah, it was really cool. It was between this honestly and the Everjail places, but the teleport gates I thought were a really fun addition that were completely optional and didn't really harm the experience at all. It was just fun little experiences.
Mm-hmm. there was one thing that like I really wanted to point out for design element, and that was the map. Not just that like it looks nice and it's got the texture or whatever, but like the way it expands as you explore more. Because you start the game and you think, oh, this is a big old area. This is huge. This game is enormous. And you look at the map and you can see it all. But then as soon as you like start to branch out, that map like it starts to expand too, like in a weird way that I don't know how to totally explain. But basically it makes you realize that like, oh, that was only a small chunk and there's actually this much more. And then there's actually this much more, and it keeps happening. So it's some kind of like visual trickery they did with the map, that as you progress through the game, it just like kept enlarging while the rest of the scale stayed the same. And I don't know, it made you, for me it was mostly like excitement, like, oh crap, like there's like a whole nother layer to this, like there's just so much more. After I feel like I'm not even close to done exploring this whole first section, right?
Do you think that the point of that was to make it so people didn't feel so overwhelmed at the jump?
Yeah, for sure. Because if they gave you that, you know, the enormity of that entire map from the beginning, you'd be like kind of starstruck. You're like, oh, I don't even.
You'd be like, oh, is
it's
this a
just too
Ubisoft
much.
game?
Yeah, exactly. But the way they do it, instead, it kind of keeps on making you excited to do more instead of overwhelming you with too much to do.
Yeah, I agreed. Next up, area. So I have a tie. It's between, you know, when you first walk through the Lendell outer walls and you come across that battleground with all the giant spears. This is like right before you approach the capital and that open, like, it's like a very golden field where a
Yeah.
battle took place.
Yeah.
I'm a sucker for that in anything. If you show me like the remnants of a war that just took place, that's totally my stuff. I love that. And obviously, once again, as I talked about earlier with the scale, it just was so cool. And that's tied with the entirety of Nokron Eternal City. Like the whole aesthetic of like the purple galaxy and all of that. It just so cool and so different from anything else in the game. So those two kind of tied. One is like obviously my favorite complete area, and the other is, oh wow, this is like a really cool jaw dropping moment of environmental storytelling, which From's always good at.
Yeah, to me it was, there's some cool stuff like right before, so you're going through like Liurnia of the Lakes, and there's a lift to take you up to the plateau, but there's kind of like this like sharp chasm, I guess, or like canal or something, I don't know, that kind of veers off towards that lift, and there's very few places to get up and down from it. I don't know, something about the way that area was set up, I just thought was really cool. Kind of hard to
It
explain.
reminded me
But,
of Lord of the Rings.
yeah, it felt like a very fantasy movie kind of vibe. It
Yeah.
felt like you were in something that like you couldn't quite, I don't know, climb, and hard to explain. But like the easy and real answer is yeah, the underground city is crazy. Like you have to fight Radon, which I'm sure he'll come up again later. And then afterwards, it's, oh, there was a meteor strike at this spot for some reason. I can't remember which NPC tells you that. And you go there, and then you like why is this meteor strike create like basically a hole to hell? It feels like, or to dig through the other side of the world. And as you traverse down it, and then you get to the bottom, and it's like, wait a minute, there's stars above me now. How are there stars? I just went underground, and then yeah, you realize like this whole city is underground. It's like an entire universe under the map. I don't know. It just felt really well designed, and it didn't feel like silly. It felt like it convinced me that that's what was here, and it just makes sense for some reason.
And that goes
and
to the
then-
exploration. Is I'm interested real quick. I wonder how many people saw the Eternal City for the first time after Radon, and how many people like me. The reason I found it first is I went to the elevator in the forest with all the giant bears. And there's an elevator that takes you down to it, and that's where I first saw the city. I'm curious to see how people actually discovered it for the first time. But go ahead, sorry.
Because that's a good point though. Because no matter which way you get there first, once you're there, you'll see like, well, wait a minute, I'm in the underground city, but I see this, platform's way off in the distance. I certainly can't get to. And then later on, you take the other entrance, and then you're on that platform. And there's like a few of those spots where you can get in. And then you follow it even deeper, and it just keeps going and going, and then all of a sudden you're in this lake of rot. You're like, what the hell? Like it just keeps on expanding and expanding on how much is down there and what's all going on in that world. It just was crazy.
It
Goes
feels like
back
it
to
could
the
have been
point
its
of
own game.
exploration.
Like,
Yeah,
above surface and then below surface could have been two entirely different games because that's how much
yeah.
was in there. Crazy. Next up, weapons. I have a three-way tie. I'll go quick on them. First is the grafted blade greatsword, which you get from the Leonin you fight at Castle Morn, whatever it's called. I can't remember the name of the castle. Basically, the Game of Thrones sword. Looks like the throne from Game of Thrones, a bunch of swords building to one giant sword. The Magmorm scale sword, which is the weapon you get
Ooh.
for the boss drop. For the boss you fight in that area you talked about where you go up the scaffolding and all that, you eventually reach a Magmorm you fight. That sword is really cool in terms of its design. But my real answer is the weapon I used throughout the entirety of the game, which was Bloodhound's Fang, the great curved sword.
Yeah.
Such a cool weapon, so good. Yeah, so three-way tie for me.
So for most of the game, I was using the Moonveil Katana, which was basically I started out as what do they call it? Archaeologist, which was the magic build basically. So I used a lot of magic, and then this katana kind of scaled with both intelligence and the magic stat. Sorry, the magic stat, which would have been intelligence and dexterity, as it's a katana. Um, but it's kind of I already forget what they call it, like the weapon art, whatever they call that in this game. The special move, more or less. Um, Basically, a large swing, either horizontal or vertical, and just a giant magical, plate of light comes off the sword and projects forward and does super damage. But what else it does is it does a lot of like stagger damage or whatever, however they calculate that. And so a lot of bosses, you hit them twice with that attack, and all of a sudden they're stunned, and then you go in for the visceral, which is again I don't know what they call it in this. That's what it was called in Bloodborne, but you go in for the visceral attack, and super satisfying to take bosses down with that. Also good for like crowd control when there's lots of enemies, things like that. But then eventually, of course, being magic build, going through Ronnie the Witch's quest, at the end of that, you get classic Moonlight Greatsword. So I kind of converted to that and sort of switched back and forth with that and the katana, because that thing was just hilariously huge and powerful, and was kind of fun to mess around with that, like two-handed. So then, of course, I had several different staffs. I don't know. Magical.
Staffs. I believe it's staffs. I don't. Yeah.
I never thought about it. Like multiple, yeah, but the plural for staff. Anyway, multiple of those. Like they had a lot of they call them gravity magic in this game, where like throwing meteors and purple orbs and things like that, as well as the typical, Dark Souls like blue magic. So some staffs are better than others at different types of magic. So I used a few different types, and things like that. So yeah, a lot of. It's still like I only use primarily like 4 or 5 weapons, throughout the entirety of the game. I tried to experiment with a few later on, but there's so much more. That to me is like probably where the most replay value is in the builds and the volume of different weapons that you can try out. So I do want to go back and hopefully we get some DLC. I'll go back and entirely respec, because that's really easy to do, like you mentioned.
Next up, NPCs. So I got 2 honorable mentions in the actual choice. First honorable mention is War Counselor E.G. for Rena. He's a giant blacksmith that works with Rena. Really cool character. Gives me a lot of like, Tyrion Lannister vibes. Really liked him. Her whole, council was a really cool idea in that game. Next up, had to mention Muriel, the turtle pastor. I love that guy. So good. The people who go and kill him, just absolute demons. And the Artorias of this game, that'll be the character I think that most people talk about for years, is Blade, or Blide, or however they pronounce it. I call him Blade. That's my headcanon is Blade. Obviously the Wolf Man. Some of the coolest looking armor in the game too that I wore. Kind of like your cosplaying has him. Yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah, Blide is definitely on my list. That guy, I don't know, just he's huge, he's tall, and like just a knight with a wolf head, and it's so simple, but it's so cool at the same time. And some bad things happen. Things don't end well for him, at least when I played the game. But he brought it upon himself, I'll say. But otherwise, Alexander the Pot Man, like we saw him in early gameplay, like before the game came out, like, and he's stuck. It's like, oh, well, you just hit me on my bum to smack me out, and it's funny or whatever, right? And that's all good, but there's one interaction with him that I had later, where he was just sitting in a lake of lava, and I didn't know he was there at first. I was exploring, grabbing some items and things, and I just hear like grunting, like kind of like, what the hell is going on? And eventually I come across him, and I had to go talk to him, even though I'm not going to last long in the lava. And he's like, I have to look up his exact lines, but he's basically like, yeah, this is pretty hot stuff. I'm really struggling out here. But he was just going, I can't remember what he said he was doing, but it just felt so like metal. Like, this dude is just chilling in the lava, like pushing through it like it's whatever. And it just cracked me up for a while. That guy, and then you see him again later, and he kind of challenges you to a duel, like a friendly duel, which was pretty fun. It kind of fits him, and yeah, he had an interesting ending to his quest line too, I'll say.
I think I would have liked him more if I ran into him more. I only really ran into him when you unstick him and then the Radon fight, and I think that was it. So I didn't really have a lot of experience with him, so that's why he's not on my list. I just didn't, talk to him that much. Let's get into our top 5 bosses. We'll go 5, 5, 4, 4, 3, 3, 2, 2, 1, 1. I'll go first. So at number 5, I have a tie between 2 early game bosses for similar reasons, but so it's Margit the Foul Omen and Godric the Grafted. Margit is the first wall in the game. Most people I know, that's where a lot of them either made it or decided to quit the game. And a lot of my friends I know who played it aren't really a lot of From people, so I was awaiting that because I had gotten to Margit and I had beaten him, and I was like, oh, I noticed it was going to be like, when you play enough From games, Dom, I was like, oh, this is intended to be the first wall for the player base, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I played, and I was like, okay. And then a lot of my friends didn't beat him and kind of stopped. It was the Asylum Demon of Elden Ring. And then obviously Godric the Grafted, because I think he is a really good display of what we know from FromSoftware games, where it's the evolution of phases, where he gets that dragon head and he puts it on his arm, and it completely changes the way that fight unfolds in the second phase. And I think they're both really cool designs too. They're like the old kings, very high fantasy, very Lord of the Rings in some capacity, which I really enjoyed. So that's my number 5. Those 2 guys, the Stormveil Castle Bros.
I'll say my number 5 is kind of 2 things. So Godric, for one, yeah, that midpoint in the fight where he just rips the dragon head off and shoves it onto his arm is like the most like extension, like the most FromSoftware thing they could do. Like, they like to just get ridiculous with the kind of physical stuff that happens in their games, and this was like them doing their shit to the max, right? When he puts that dragon on his arm and starts breathing fire out of it, it's like, what the heck? And then kind of another boss on my list is Godfrey. So the first Elden Lord, when you fight very, very end of the game, who has this kind of lion coming off of his back for the first half of the fight, but then the second half, he entirely rips that lion off. Maybe we should have like a spoiler warning at the beginning of this podcast. If it's not obvious.
It's a Spoilercast.
Yeah.
It's a Spoilercast. Yeah, people are like, yeah.
Yeah. For some reason I hesitate. I'm like, wait a minute. Anyway, he just entirely rips the lion off of his back, and I'm just getting myself psyched up and prepared for like what kind of horrible, disgusting, insane, berserk kind of stuff is he going to do next for the second phase of this fight, right? But then, of course, it's nothing. He just rips the lion off, and then he's just fighting you with his bare hands, no weapons, and he's just like, I am the warrior. Just like, and he's even tougher at that point, and more aggressive. But it was like the way that they subverted my expectations on that in that fight worked really, really well, because I just was like, oh God, what's he about to do? He's just ripped the lion off. Is he gonna like put it on his head, or is he gonna ride it, or I don't even know. But then it was just no. He's just dude. He's just Horaloo, warrior. Anyway, yeah. So that's 2 from my list.
Number 4 for me is the beast clergyman that turns into Malekith the Black Blade.
Yes.
So this is a really cool reveal too, because you run up into this room and you're like, okay, there's this beast clergyman. He's kind of tough, but not really. He's kind of whatever. And I honestly thought it was the same beastman from the era you can get teleported to, right? Where you like give him enough of that consumable and he ends up going crazy. I thought it might have been the same person. And you fight this person, you take out the beast clergyman. Obviously, there's a second phase. To your point, it's like, well, what is this person going to do? What's going to happen? They unveil their robe, obviously, after stabbing their own hand, and it becomes Malekith the Black Blade, who, in my opinion, has some of the most difficult movement and aggression
Oh,
to deal with out of
so
any of the
hard.
bosses in the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's just on you constantly. He rarely gives you a moment to heal
He was
or
a Bloodborne
breathe.
boss. What he was.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah. Yeah, I just love his design from a purely aesthetic standpoint, and then the fight itself was so different than anything else that it really made you challenge your own capacities for combat in the game. So, yeah, that's my number 4 is Malekith the Black Blade.
So the one that is on the other end of the teleport, where it's like he's in like a temple or whatever. Did you fight him?
I never got around to killing him. No,
Okay.
you
I
can
mean,
spoil it.
I'm trying to remember what happens at the end of it, but basically you start fighting him, and halfway through, he stops, kind of like Patches did, and I think he just goes back to just being friendly after that. Can't
Oh,
remember
okay.
the rest of the exchange, but I was really confused by it. Oh, I guess we're cool now. Um,
I
I
just
have
let
to
that guy go stay mad in that in that building for the rest of eternity.
because it was so shocking. It was like you've been trading him stuff, and he's been giving you spells and things, and then all of a sudden, one of the times you finally go back, and he is just like an amorphous of rage, just destroying you. And he absolutely wrecked me the first couple times I tried to fight him in like 2 hits. Like again, like Malekith, like just super aggressive, and it just caught me off guard. But eventually, yeah, he just kind of stops once you get him down enough. But anyway, I'll do. Let's see. I think for 3, I'm gonna say Radagon, who was, which is apparently Radagon is the same person as, oh my goodness, not Millennia, but oh my goodness, Mikella, I think. Doesn't matter. Anyway, the first half of the final boss fight, of which the second half you said you didn't like, but the first half is great. It's just a regular humanoid dude, not super big or anything. Just has this, kind of light hammer, and the music that goes with it, and the pacing and the way that he fights, and it felt kind of like a dance. It just was super satisfying when you were able to dodge him, and learn his moveset. It was just like a classic, kind of a classic Dark Souls boss where it just feels super satisfying once you start to get the moves down and dodge and hit them back, and plus like the effects of the lightning and everything around him. It was just really cool. And I also wasn't a big fan of the follow-up boss after him, but Radagon for sure was a cool fight.
Yeah, it's the blacksmith from the first trailer. It's like that dude, and he ends up being the final boss. It's just sick. When he's hammering away when we see it. Yeah, he would have made my list if it wasn't for the second half of that fight. That second half of that fight was so disappointing to me that he didn't make my top 5. But if it counted as 2 separate fights, he might have been 1 or 2 for me. Honestly, it's just the whole spectacle of the fight is so cool. The arena, everything about it. Number 3 for me is Godskin Duo. So obviously you fight some of these Godskin dudes throughout the game individually. One's tall, skinny, and does like a weird Mr. Fantastic penis thing. The other one's like a big blob guy. But towards the end of the game in Crumbling Fair Missoula, you come across both of them as a pair, and they're both a little bit more powerful than what you fought them before, and you have to fight them both at the same time. And this is the Ornstein Smaug moment of Elden Ring, and of course, From knows how to pull on those heartstrings. You give me a fight like that, and I'm gonna love it. So I really enjoyed the pairing of those guys. I honestly think it would have been higher if I hadn't already fought those bosses individually beforehand. But I still enjoyed it because they present such unique challenges on their own. So shout out to the Godskin Duo.
Yeah, they would have made my list if they weren't just fucking bullshit. Just absolute like. It was so difficult. Like, I couldn't even get close because, especially the large round guy, when he does that thing where he just enlarges and then is just rolling towards you through the pillars
Non-stop.
And just, like, yeah, with just relentless and like, that's a tough. Or in retrospect, it's kind of weird because Ornstein and Smaug, I remember it took hours upon hours to finally beat them. The first time I played Dark Souls, and it just to me was like that was the hardest fight of any game ever, right? But now I've like in recent playthroughs of Dark Souls and watching streams and stuff, I'm like they actually move pretty slow and it's not that hard, like at all. I'm like kind of wondering why it was so hard in the beginning, like the first time I
But
fought
it
them.
also
But
is like a hindsight thing, right?
yeah, I must just be too familiar.
Because was the original Dark Souls, what game was that in your From Software catalog play?
Oh, the first one. Yep.
Same, right?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people I end up seeing play it and stream it are coming off of playing Sekiro or coming off of playing Dark Souls 2 or 3 or Elden Ring. So it's like they already have the understanding of the combat. Whereas I think if you go in there without an understanding of how From games are, by the time you get to that point, it is a challenge. Because, well, no, that's not true. I was going to say it's the first time you fight two bosses, but the gargoyles are the first time you fight two
Oh yeah.
bosses.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I've,
it is a hindsight thing, I think. But yeah,
I'm a bit.
I'm the same way. I see people fight, I'm like, wow, this looks way less challenging than
Yeah.
I remember playing it.
I'll always remain like a little salty, a little tilted after watching Andy Cortez beat them on the very first try.
First try.
And I'm
Yeah.
like, you motherfucker. I just. Anyway. Yeah. Godskin Duo, though, compared to Ornstein and Smile, it feels like 1,000 times harder. I'm like, oh, maybe eventually I'll get to a place where they're as easy as Ornstein and Smile are now. But anyway,
I got.
my actual.
Let me say my number 2 real quick because you already
Oh, yeah,
mentioned
you
him,
go ahead.
which is Godfrey, real quick.
Okay.
Godfrey first Elden Lord, and then he obviously turns into Horalu. The reason I like this fight so much is the turn on expectations, but also that second form of his feels like you're playing a fighting game in a 3D space. Like he feels like a fighting
Yeah.
game character,
That's a good
which
way to
is
put it.
really cool. And offers a different challenge. And obviously that arena is really cool. It's like a circular platform that you're on near the top of the Capitol. And I do like the change in expectation there of you expecting him to turn to this nasty lion beast monster. And funny enough, even though he doesn't do that and he becomes stripped down to the core of who he is, it still met the expectations because you see pictures of this guy throughout the game, like paintings. Like, who's this guy with this lion on his back? Yeah, so shout out to Godfrey.
And then, so his name is Horalu, and I've not looked into this yet, but one of the NPCs you can have a quest for is Nephili Lu. And I think that like that's supposed to be her dad. I don't know. I'm gonna have to look into that. But anyway, my next one, and this is tough. I'll say for 2 is the ancestral spirit. So this was in the underground city. You light these. They're not quite torches. They're just fancy, really fancy torches, I guess. Whatever. There's like 6 of them or something. You light them all, and then you'll be able to find your way into this weird spiritual realm looking place. And this giant, super huge, like spiritual deer kind of a fight. And it's very blue and magical looking, and I don't know, something about it. Just like some of the other fights, it's everything in the arena, the music, the feel of it all. It just felt it wasn't a very difficult fight. I think I only spent like 3 or 4 tries on him, but it just was super cool, and something about it felt unique and psychedelic and calming. Felt like I was one with nature or something like that. Some kind of corny thing, but it was just a super cool fight that I have to point out that I think, obviously it's super optional, kind of a boss, but it is very cool.
It's very like ethereal and kind of like majestic. Like I love that boss design. Yeah, they're not overly difficult, but it's super unique and it's like kind of serene in a creepy way because the environment you're in is kind of quiet and it's like a spectral steed. And yeah, I like it. Underrated boss fight, I think, in that game. I think a lot of people probably run into that and like, hey, it wasn't difficult, whatever, but I think the whole spectacle of it is worthy of a place on anybody's list. Number 1 for me is Radon. I think the whole scale of that, the way it felt like an event, you're gathering these NPCs to fight. It was like one of the strongest narrative parts of the game in its entirety. Uh, just the aesthetic of seeing this giant dude on this tiny little horse begging for its life, like you saw that thing was struggling. So cool how he comes down like a comet. The whole story about him, it to me felt like the coolest boss fight, and I don't know. It seems like that's the one they were like, this needs to be in the game. This is like a thing we want to make as a big point of emphasis for Elden Ring. And the other thing I want to mention is Millennia isn't on my list because I didn't get around to actually fighting her in my playthrough. It's something that I was like, by the time I was finished them, I was like, oh, do I want to go through getting to the optional area and fighting her, or do I want to power through and finish the game, and maybe I can go to that on a second playthrough or something. So that's why she isn't on my list. And then I already mentioned why Radagon isn't, because the second half of that fight is no bueno in my opinion. But yeah, Radagon's my number one boss fight.
Yeah, I had Radon as one too. It's just you learn about him, before you get there, and that from Blide actually, and that it's not only like there's like a festival where everyone's gonna go try to fight him, like collectively, like every hero or every NPC in the game mostly is like gonna team up to try to fight this one guy, and you hear about it and like, okay, that's weird, and you make your way down there, and sure enough, just start summoning dudes. Like, just start summoning all these NPCs, and it's starting to feel like, holy crap. And really, before you actually enter the arena to fight him in, which is a giant desert that's like barren, but you're in this castle, and people are starting to crowd up or whatever, and there's like everyone's getting ready, and there's like a guy giving a speech, and it is this whole festival, this whole event where like you're all just gonna try to kill this Radon guy that we've heard about, who can apparently like stop the stars from moving, which is hard to comprehend, and it's a bit abstract, but
he can stop the stars, but he doesn't like to walk.
Right. And that's why once you kill him, one of those meteors, creates an entrance to the underground city, because he's no longer stopping the stars, right? But anyway, yeah, you get in there after summoning all these dudes, and then you take 5 steps forward into this desert, and then all of a sudden this projectile hits you, and you're dead in one hit, and you're like, what the heck was that? That's it? I didn't even see anybody. It's just a desert hill. And then you reload and you go back in, and you're like, okay, I'm going to be ready this time. And then all of a sudden you're trying to look, but all of a sudden it's so fast and it hits you and it kills you again in one hit. And you're like, what on earth is this fight? What is this game? Miyazaki, what are you trying to do to me? And you just get so confusing. But then, a couple more tries and you start to learn, like, okay, these structures I can stand behind that'll block the projectiles, and I got to keep moving, keep summoning people. And eventually, yeah, you get close enough to him and actually fight him, which is entirely, I don't know how anyone could beat him not with projectiles or magic from a horse. I don't know how anyone could do that if they had to like fight him melee. That would be incredibly difficult.
I used a melee weapon, so that was me.
So,
you're talking
kudos to you.
Well, and one of the coolest parts about this fight, and I think some people get mad at it, but it's a boss fight in Elden Ring where you finally beat it, and then you realize that some people were able to cheese it by making him comet drop into the water and immediately killing himself.
Oh.
And you're like, oh, there was cheese for this. I fought him the normal way and beat him, and then people are just cheesing it. I know some people might get upset by that, but I think it's entirely hilarious that there's just this like perfectly designed boss where you're supposed to fill these certain things and attack it in a certain way, and somebody's like, I wonder if when he's coming down, if I stand close enough to this edge, will he just fall in the water? And he does. And
Sure
it cheeses him, and it's really funny. Yeah, so shout out to Radon. Next up, we would have talked about the final fight. We've kind of already harped on it about how much we loved Radagon, and for me, how much I disliked the second part, so we don't really need to spend too much time on that. Next up, with the game over, we're wondering, are we going to get DLC and what we want from it? My answer is pretty simple. I would want a large handcrafted dungeon. So I don't need something added to the overworld. I would love just a giant like dungeon area added. And I want more giant bosses. Like for me, it'd be really cool if one of the, the people I mentioned where you see the dead body sitting in the giant throne in the Eternal City, right?
Mm-hmm.
It'd be cool if that ended up being one of the bosses in the DLC. Like I want large scale bosses, like grand colossal beings, to fight, and maybe it is like the theme of the DLC has to do with giants or something. But those are my two wants. Like I want a giant handcrafted dungeon, and I want giant in terms of scale bosses.
So apparently, and I didn't know this like while playing, but there's like Stormvale Castle, and then the capital, and the university or whatever they call it. And certain like dungeons that are large created in the game. They're called like legacy dungeons, which is apparently like an official term, but basically meant to like kind of give you that Dark Souls, gameplay where it isn't just an open world. There's also these more constricted, large areas, but you have to navigate through them and make shortcuts and things like that. So I definitely want more of those. One or two, probably realistically one big legacy dungeon. And then, but also I do like, I think you still also have to do more of the open world too. If I think of what DLC should be, I guess like it's more of everything that game did. So like another legacy dungeon, a whole nother section of open world map, some more NPCs, or like continuing NPC quests that were already there into this new area or whatever it is. Obviously more weapons, spells, etc., and cool bosses. Yeah, some giant bosses, like you said, would be cool always. So it's just realistically just more of what Elden Ring did. Obviously, like if a new area, like, well, as different as it could look and feel from the existing areas too. I don't think like for DLC, it's not usually rocket science. There's not so much expectation of like reinventing the wheel, right? So,
and we trust what From will give us anyways. So
yeah.
It's like, yeah.
And then what they also always do is like continue or like expand on the core narrative from the first game. They're usually pretty good about that, where it's not just like some side thing that is kind of adjacent to the main story. It's actually like pretty a crucial part, like involves characters that we've already met.
And it doesn't have to be linear necessarily.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we could go back in the past and experience something that's already taken place. Can't wait. Hopefully it's announced by the end of the year. Next up, should it get a sequel? Selfishly, yes, I definitely want a sequel. But when I've thought about this, FromSoftware provided enough that I would be satiated with this being all of what we got from Elden Ring. Add on the DLC. We've talked about how much replay value there is there. Monetarily, the amount of money they've made from this game, I wouldn't be surprised if they automatically greenlit a sequel. But at the same time, I don't know if, in some ways this feels like a trilogy of games packed into one experience because of how extensive it is. So I wouldn't be bummed if we didn't get one, but if you're saying like, do you want a sequel? Yeah, of course.
Right. Just like the DLC, of course I want it, and a sequel, absolutely. I'm not convinced that they would do it. Like the unprecedented thing is like how much money and how many copies this game sold, right? So it's kind of it'd be hard to convince.
But the counter argument is like, couldn't they get that with a different IP as well, right? Like that'd be the counter argument because it is FromSoftware.
To a lesser extent, of course, but yeah, you still put on there like from the creators of Elden Ring. That still doesn't go near like as far as like if you just called it Elden Ring 2 or Elden Ring subtitle, right? But they don't typically do that. They did Dark Souls 2 and 3. But otherwise they've stayed, Demon Souls was kind of a unique scenario because they couldn't use that name anymore after they did that game.
Bloodborne was PlayStation published.
So we don't know.
Sekiro was Activision published.
So we don't. I guess it's kind of they've done sequels, but not always. But there's too many other factors to necessarily say if they're like entirely for or against them. Because they're not owned by any other company. I don't think. I think FromSoftware, they obviously work with many publishers, but I think
they're independent. I'm pretty sure.
Independent, so they really do whatever the heck they want. Even if it is, not cashing in on sequel money. I think that changes the equation a little bit for me too. Because like if they're owned by Activision, I'd be like, well, obviously they're going to be a sequel, right?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess we can get into our final thoughts here before we close out. For me, I think it's FromSoftware and Hidetaka Miyazaki's magnum opus, Elden Ring. I think it's just their culmination of everything they've done. It takes their level design, their environmental storytelling, their combat, all of that stuff, and nails it in experience they've never tried before. And everything they've done before this has led to this game. You can see the imprints of all of those games. I could totally see them going in a different direction, honestly. I wouldn't be surprised if their next game, which is currently rumored to be that next Armored Core reboot, is vastly different. Because I could totally see Miyazaki wanting to kind of do a palate cleanser game and get away from this because they have been so focused creatively on these type of games for so long. I think that's why they did the Diracine, the VR game, because I think it was one of those refreshing palette cleansers for them. But then again, I could see a Sekiro or Bloodborne sequel also coming, which wouldn't be shocking. Bloodborne sequel would be shocking at this point based on all the information we have. A Sekiro one, no way that I would not be surprised if Activision is like, hey, we could use a win right now. Let's green light another game from those dudes who win Game of the Year and sell a bunch of copies of their games. Yeah, those are my final thoughts. Elden Ring, incredible.
So I'll have some good final thoughts. So like, let's assume, and it's a largely safe assumption, that Elden Ring is gonna win the Game Award for Game of the Year. Maybe if God of War still comes out this year, I think it's like November, so it would still be within the cutoff. It could have a chance to surpass. Otherwise, I'm not sure what else. Like Horizon, I think would have a tough time, beating it. But anyway, that obviously Sekiro also won a Game of the Year in 2019 from the Game Awards. So I'm wondering how many development studios have had 2 or 3 or more or whatever Game of the Years, or you know what I mean? Because it feels like FromSoftware is about to have that. So I feel like Rockstar might have Grand Theft Auto or Red Dead or something, but I think like FromSoftware is now firmly planted in that territory, in that group of developers, with Rockstar and Naughty Dog and maybe like a Bungie or whoever else like that. To me, like, this game has like firmly, even like with a larger crowd, this is no longer just like a niche genre or game. Like, this has enough broad appeal. Yeah, it's still not for everyone, of course, but I feel like that's kind of the final thought I have, is like FromSoftware is really like making a legacy here, I feel.
Yeah, and to your point, no one's won 2 Game of the Year awards, so I'll go through them real quick. 2014, Dragon Age Inquisition from BioWare. 2015, Witcher 3. 2016, Overwatch. 2017, Breath of the Wild. 2018, God of War. 2019, Sekiro. 2020, Last of Us Part 2. 2021, It Takes Two. So you could technically say EA, because EA published Dragon Age and they published It Takes Two, but Also, FromSoftware isn't
2014, so I guess that's part of it.
FromSoftware isn't independent, technically. They're owned by Katakawa Dwango Corporation, which is a Japanese media conglomerate. So they're independent from a Western viewpoint, I guess, because it's a Japanese conglomerate, but they're not technically independent. They're owned by a corporation, which I didn't know.
Interesting.
Yeah. That's it for this show. Thank you guys for listening to our Spoilercast. I absolutely love FromSoftware and Elden Ring. Hopefully you enjoyed our talk about our favorite parts of the game. If you can, please follow us on your favorite podcast service, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Leave a review. It helps us out. On YouTube, search Controlled Interest. You'll find the video form of the podcast. You can head over to controlledinterest.com to listen to the audio there if you don't want to use any of those specified platforms, and just download the podcast yourself. Otherwise, you can follow us on Twitter at collectively at CTRLINT. It's Controlled Interest abbreviated. You can follow Dom at OBDomKenobi. The O in OB is the number 0, not the letter O. And I am at Jerrad Wyche, JERRADWYCHE. And we'll catch you guys for episode 251. We're back to the grind of talking about video game news. And hopefully Warner Brothers doesn't collapse on itself and we have to talk about the future of, Batman and all of those games. Anyways, we'll see you guys next time. Dom, close us out with the Elden Ring catchphrase.
Let's keep Elden blinging. Or no, let's get that Elden bling.
See you guys next time. Bye.